Hallo, velkommen til Forenklingsdagen. Da kan dere finne deres plasser. Velkommen, velkommen. Jeg heter Lars, jeg er markedssjef i Vips, og har gleden av å introdusere dere til denne dagen. Jeg hater knot, og det gjør resten av mine 270 kollegaer i Vips. Knot, friksjon, irriterende, dritt, alt mulig, antagelig ord dere kan tenke på dere. Men det vi vet er at knot er vår alles kryptonitt. Vi bare dør når vi ser noen sånn friksjon og irritasjon i livet vårt. Vi bare sånn sakte, men sikkert, så dør vi ut. Jeg tror faktisk vi burde gått på sånn sinnemestringskurs.
Bare rive her, ja. Akkurat, ja. Det er det som er greia. Kan vi se om det. Åja, akkurat, ja. Det skulle bare sprute opp sånn, ja. Åja, det er det som var meningen. Åja, akkurat, ja. Ja vel, ja, det er greit, da. Skal bare helle. Åja, det skal bare komme sånn, ja. Akkurat, ja vel.
Fortsatt Norges morsomste sketsj fra Atle Antonsen. Og det fascinerende er jo, nå har vi heldigvis funnet på noen funnet på den ideen KORK. Det er helt fantastisk, man har reddet lørdagsmorgen til mange her ute. Men vi i Vips, vi har startet en kanal for en tid tilbake som har blitt en av våre mest morsomste og største kanaler, altså Slack-kanaler, i Vips. Og den heter Knot. Hvor rett og slett alle Vipsere deler en kanal, altså hvor de deler alt mulig rart av hverdagsknot, stort og smått. Så jeg har lyst til å bare introdusere hele dagen med å vise noen av det beste herfra. Vi begynner med denne her. Er det noen andre av dere som også blir irritert av den lille plastikkgreia der, eller? Altså, hvem er det som har en saks i nærheten av garderoben sin, og når man ikke har det, og prøver å dra den ut og ødelegge sokken sin, det er utrolig irriterende. Det må gjøres noe med. En annen som har lagt ut, som ikke er sånn åpenbar, men som når dere skjønner den, altså, hvorfor har ikke pølsebransjen og lompe- og brødbransjen møttes og blitt enige om et antall? Hvorfor må det være 10 der og 8 der? Ja, det er også en av de mest likte knotpostene våre. Jeg skjønner det ikke. Det er så enkelt å fikse. Litt nærmere oss, i utlandet så har de en sånn butikk som vi har app for. Tenk deg å gå inn i en butikk for å overføre penger da, og stå i kø og holde på. Det driver de med i utlandet da. Dette er jo en klassiker som vi har tatt opp kampen mot, som sikkert mange blir svette av å bare se på. Altså, for det første skal du begynne å finne deg et passord for det her, og så går du kanskje innom den siden sånn en gang i hver 14. dag, eller en gang i måneden, og så skal du huske det igjen. Altså, kona mi vi kranglet om et passordproblem i går, faktisk, så det der er irriterende greier. En annen ting, er det noen av dere som har prøvd å overføre penger til utlandet? Jeg bodde i Danmark i mange år, og hadde gleden, eller den grufulle opplevelsen av å prøve å fylle ut sånne ting her. Hvem er det av dere som liksom vet hva liksom en Swift-adresse er? Det er vanskelig å rote til ting, og det bringer meg jo litt sånn over til, bare for kort nevne at vi skal jo fusjonere med MobilePay. Det skjer nå på tirsdag, faktisk. Og kanskje noen av dere har fått det med, men ambisjonen vår er jo da selvsagt løse sånn hverdagsknot, deriblant denne Swift-adressen. Og det gir oss uendelige muligheter for forenkling. Men først så er vi nødt til å jobbe litt på maskinrommet og bygge en felles teknisk plattform. Så for alle dere så vil dere ikke merke noen forskjell. Men når det skjer, så skal dere nok få vite det i god tid i forveien. Nok om det. All these examples of friction is something we all recognize and laugh about. But it's not only laughable. Removing them is critical for our and your business. At last, someone has written a common sense practical guide to using behavioral science to sell things. These are not my words, but they are many of the great reviews of this book. Let me read out one more just to bring you into this. Most books in this area are academic and dry as dust. If you want to know how research and sociology can impact real life in the real world, Richard's book will show you, using simple words and examples that real people can understand. Me and the team, the marketing team, had the pleasure back in the spring of our very own workshop with Richard, where we instantly thought that it would be really på lag to share his wisdom with our partners in the fight against friction. And Richard, he has even challenged his own fear of flight to coming here to Norway today. So without further ado, please welcome the man behind the Choice Factory, Mr. Richard Shotton.
Good morning. Very nice to meet you all. Today's talk is going to be around behavioural science. And if you're not familiar with that phrase, it's nothing complicated. It's essentially what people used to call social psychology. It's essentially the study of how people actually behave rather than how they claim to behave. Now, this field has been active for about 130 years. The first experiments go back to the 1890s, run by people like Hermann Ebbinghaus. So there are thousands upon thousands of different insights and experiments that you can use to solve your business challenges. But today, we're going to be focusing on one particular area. And the area I want to focus on draws a lot on the work of this man. So you might recognize him. This is Daniel Kahneman. He was the Nobel Prize winner for economics back in 2002. So he's one of the most illustrious behavioural scientists there is. And in a recent interview, when Kahneman was asked to look back over his 50-year career of running experiments, he was asked, what's the single biggest thing that he's learned? And Kahneman said, well, that's easy. It's all around removing friction, making it easier. And in fact, he used a wonderful car driving analogy to explain his ideas. He said, look, there are two ways to change people's behaviour. You can either push down the accelerator. That is, you can motivate people to want to change, to want your products, to want to exercise more. Or, he said, you can release the handbrake. That is, you can remove those small bits of friction, those small barriers that are stopping people behaving the way that you want. And Kahneman said the single biggest thing that he'd learned was that it is often more effective to focus on releasing the handbrake rather than pushing down the accelerator. So his argument is that even seemingly inconsequential bits of friction can have an outsized effect. Now, that's all very well and good that an illustrious figure says that, but one of the things I love about behavioural science is that no one is taken on their word alone. Even if you're a Nobel Prize winner, everything has to be proved experimentally. But there's certainly an awful lot of experimental evidence that backs up his idea, backs up this idea that small bits of friction can have an outsized effect. So this is a study published in 2018 by David Olshan at Penn University. And it's a real-world study. He worked with a hospital, and that hospital allowed him access to the prescribing data. So he could see what drugs were being prescribed to patients. And he monitored that data from 2014 to 2017. And when doctors were prescribing drugs at this hospital, they had a very straightforward computer system. They would put in the patient details, the disease, and then they would see a drop-down menu of drugs. So you'd go through the branded drugs at the top, and then the generic drugs at the bottom. You could just scroll up and down to get the drug that you needed. Now, before Olshan made his intervention, so this is pre-intervention, early 2014, about 75% of the drugs prescribed were generic drugs. So each line here represents the prescription rate of an individual drug, all the generic drugs that were on offer. Then in November 2014, Olshan makes a very small change, the prescription approach. Remember, there was that drop-down menu with branded drugs at the top, generic ones at the bottom. All Olshan did was flip the order. So now you have generic drugs at the top, branded ones at the bottom. Now you can see immediately after this intervention is made, a radical change in prescription rates. You now have 98% of the drugs being prescribed being generics rather than branded. Now, you would think that a professional, a doctor, would be just weighing up issues like what's the most effective drug, what's the price of these different drugs. But even these highly intelligent, rational decision makers were influenced by very, very small bits of friction. That second or two that it took to scroll up and down a menu deeply influenced what they gave to patients. Now, this study about the outsized effects of friction is not a one-off. It's a big theme in behavioural science. So I'll show you one more study, I think, that corroborates this point, but also develops the idea a bit more. And it's a study from two American psychologists called Bergman and Rogers. And back in 2017, they ran a study with the American Department of Education. So the Department of Education wanted to launch a new service for parents. Now, you as a parent could sign up to this service and you would be texted information about how to encourage your children to work harder. The psychologists launched the new service in one of three ways. So the first way, this is what they called the standard sign-up route, which was slightly difficult. They texted a random group of parents information about why the service was amazing, and then at the bottom of that text message, they put a tiny link, which if you clicked on, took people through to a web form. That web form took about 45 seconds to fill in, and if people filled it in, they were enrolled. Now, when they launched the service in that way, 1% of people signed up. 1%. Next scenario, another group of randomly selected parents texted exactly the same information about why the service was amazing, but this time they were told, if you want to sign up, text back the word start. So this removes about 45 or 50 seconds of effort. It only takes a few seconds to text that word back. But even the removal of that small bit of effort in what is a very important area led to a significant increase in sign-up rates. We get an 8-fold increase in sign-up rates, 8% of people in this scenario. And then the final version, so this is all pre-GDPR, the auto-enrollment version. Another group of randomly selected parents texted the same information about the service, but this time they were told, you are enrolled. If you don't want to be, text back the word stop. And in that scenario, we get 96% of people signing up. So we have this 95 percentage point swing in behaviour based on the removal of really tiny bits of friction. So far, this is backing up the work of Olshan, this is backing up the work of Kahneman, essentially showing once more, you remove small bits of friction, you get very large effects. But this was just the first part of the experiment. The clever bit comes next. Now the psychologists go out and get 130 experts in education. Policymakers, head teachers, school administrators, people who know parents very well. And they say to those experts, we're going to run this experiment, there's going to be these three scenarios. What do you think the sign-up rates will be in each scenario? Now, those experts aren't stupid. They know very well that friction will put people off. So they get the direction of change right, but they wildly underestimate the scale of the impact. So they think there will be 39% of people signing up in the standard route, 44 in the simplified, 66 in the auto-enrollment. So they think there will be a 27 percentage point swing in behaviour. Whereas remember, in reality, it was a 96 percentage point swing in behaviour, or 95 percentage point swing in behaviour. Bergman and Rogers argue that these experts are typical. Again and again, when people are asked to predict what will influence others, they think it's all about motivation. You know, they emphasise how good the content is or how useful the service is. Now, of course, that's important. But what Bergman and Rogers show from this study and others is that people tend to underestimate the importance of friction. Now, if we are underestimating the importance of friction in business and government, that has a dangerous effect. What it means is that businesses and governments put too large a proportion of their budget into motivating people to want to change, and too small a proportion of their budget, their time, their effort into making it as easy as possible to change. So probably the key message from today is have a think about your company. You know, go through that customer journey and identify what are even the tiniest, most insignificant bits of friction that are stopping people behaving the way that you want, whether that's customers buying your product or colleagues behaving a particular way, and then put more effort into removing those bits of friction. It will tend to have an outsized effect. So this plea is really about doing more of the things we know we should, realigning our priorities, realigning our budgets. So if you're an FMCG brand or a CPG brand, think about, well, you know, can we move people from having to go to store every week to buy the shampoo or the soap? Could we move them onto subscriptions? You know, that's the ultimate friction removal. If you're an e-commerce brand, you know, can you pre-populate forms? Can you remove steps on the product journey? You know, all of those will have an outsized effect. You know, and this isn't just something that happens in psychology experiments. You know, you can see this when you look around through the world. Think about Amazon's success. How much of that has been built on that relentless removal of friction? You know, their move to have a one-click purchasing option, you know, phenomenally successful. You know, it just removed 1 or 2 clicks, and yet it boosted their sales so much. Now, at this stage, many people think, well, this is all very good in theory, but I've already made my customer journey as simple and straightforward as possible. And if you're thinking that, I would sound a note of caution. Because, yes, there are obvious things that we can do more of, but I think sometimes there are hidden ways, lateral ways, creative ways of removing friction. And to give you an example of that, I want to take you through the experience of a wonderful restaurant in London. So has anyone ever been to this restaurant? Okay. Well, if you ever go to London, worth a trip. So it's a very fancy, very plush restaurant in central London. And it was actually set up by an ex-creative at Ogilvy, Russia, a man called Leonid Shotton. So Shotton leaves Russia a few years ago, comes to London, and decides he wants to set up this restaurant. And he's interested in the concept of friction. And he wants to apply this idea to the champagne ordering process. Now remember, every restaurant in the history of restaurants, up until this one, has thought that it's already super easy to order champagne. You know, all you have to do is stick your hand up, a waiter will come over and give you an overpriced bottle of champagne. It seems very, very easy. But Shotton thought about this a bit more deeply. And he recognised, even in something that seems so simple, there are hidden bits of friction. For example, if you're with a friend you have to stop your conversation. Now, that's a bit of friction if you want to order a bottle of champagne. If you are shy, well, maybe waving your arm around and not getting noticed could cause you social embarrassment. That's a bit of friction in the ordering process. So Shotton changed how you order a bottle of champagne at his restaurant. Now, when you go to your plush booth where you sit down, there is a brass plaque next to every table. And on that plaque, there is a button. And above that button, it says press for champagne. And that has unleashed pent-up demand. Shotton claims that this restaurant sells more champagne than any other restaurant in the entire country. Now, being a selfless researcher, I thought I had to go to the restaurant to test out whether this was true. And it does seem true. You go to the restaurant and people are, their waiters are bringing bottles of champagne left, right, and centre. I spoke to one of the waiters and he said he reckoned that about 95% of people ended up ordering champagne. So if you think you have made your customer journey as simple as it can possibly be, remember the champagne button. If you think about the problem a bit more laterally, a bit more creatively, you can often unearth hidden bits of friction. But it's not just a plea to you to think about this creatively and to think a bit more about friction. There are some very specific ways I think you can make the purchasing process as seamless as possible. And I want to start by taking you through a wonderful set of experiments run by the British government back in 2013. Now, I realise talking about anything wonderful and the British government might feel a bit shocking, but it does occasionally happen. Now, back in 2013, they, like many countries, had the issue that not enough people had pensions. So it's a huge time bomb for the government. More and more people are heading for a problematic old age. So they want to do everything they can to encourage people to enrol in a pension. Now, in 2013, the law as it stood was that if you wanted to be part of your company pension scheme, as an employee, you had to opt in. So you had to fill in a 5-minute form to access the pension and then get essentially often free cash from that company and lots of tax benefits. Now, even though it makes absolute sense to join a pension, the government is very generous with its tax breaks around pensions. In that year, amongst large companies, only 61% of people were enrolled in their company pension scheme. Later on in 2013, the government applies some of these principles of Make It Easy to pensions, and they change what's known as the default. So essentially, it used to be you had to opt into your pension. From late 2013, you had to opt out of your pension. So if you joined a company, you had to fill in 5 minutes of paperwork not to be in the pension. And 6 months after they did that, the pension enrolment rate had gone up by 22 percentage points. So 83% of people were now enrolled. Now, remember, it's 5 minutes of admin. It is a tiny amount of work versus the billions of pounds that the governments give in subsidies for pensions. Yet, the single biggest thing that has changed British pension enrolment rates is the removal of friction, the changing of this, the default setting. So, where possible, think about defaults. Are there situations in which you can harness this idea? And essentially the idea here is people follow the path of least resistance. So if you put them on a particular path, a significant proportion will not remove themselves from that path. It might feel like government examples are one thing, but what can we do with this commercially? But if you look around, you can see this idea being applied in far more commercial spaces. So think about Netflix. What Netflix used to do was expect people to make a huge effort of reaching over for their remote control to click to say they wanted to watch the next program. They then changed that. They changed the default so that they had autoplay. Now with Netflix, you have to actively get your remote control and say that you don't want to watch the next program coming up. That's harnessing defaults. So think about how can you set the default to work in your favor rather than against it. But that's not the only way you can apply this principle of make it easy. Sometimes there are more counterintuitive ways of applying this idea. And I want to take you through a couple of those now. So this first study is about an idea called choice paralysis. And the initial, and I should admit slightly controversial experiment was by a Columbia University psychologist called Sheena Iyengar. And this was run back in 2000. So in 2000, Iyengar sets up a stall selling jam in an upmarket supermarket called Draeger's. And this is in California. Now, the twist in the experiment is sometimes that stand has 6 varieties of jam. Sometimes it has 24 varieties of jam. And what Iyengar found was that in terms of stopping rates, you know, the number of people who stopped and looked at the jams, more people stopped when there was that broad range, which kind of makes sense. You know, more varieties, the higher chance there is that the shopper's favourite flavour might be there. But brands don't care about stopping rates, they care about sales rates. And when Iyengar looked at sales rates, there was a wildly different pattern. She found that there were nearly 10 times more sales, even accounting for lower stopping rates, there were nearly 10 times more sales amongst that smaller variety of jam. What Iyengar argued was that if people face excess choice, they tend to react not by being pleased by that and glad that there is an opportunity to meet their very specific personal needs. If they are faced by excess choice, it tends to make the act of picking onerous, and when faced by an onerous task, what most people think is, well, I can't be bothered to do that, I'll leave it for another day, I'll come back. And often they never do. So we get this slightly strange situation in which offering people too many tasks, too many options, actually reduces sales. Now, I did say that was a slightly controversial experiment. That experiment was run in 2000, and it was a one-off study. Later studies found a bit more of a nuanced picture. And I think that's the case with behavioural science. You sometimes hear these headline findings, but then when you look at the entire body of work, you often see a more nuanced picture. And what later experiments found is that sometimes choice paralysis occurs and sometimes it doesn't. So during the mid-2000s, many people thought, well, maybe this is just a fake finding, this is something that is just random. But slightly later, a wonderful psychologist called Alexander Chernev did what's called a meta-analysis. So back in 2015, he looks at 53 different studies into choice paralysis. And he says, yes, if you look at them as a homogeneous group, increasing choice is as likely to boost sales as decrease it. But, he said, there are very predictable circumstances in which choice paralysis occurs. So the times when increasing choice dampens sales can be predicted very accurately. So Chernev said there were 4 times. He said, if your audience has no well-defined preferences, choice paralysis is likely to occur. If your audience are unfamiliar with the options, choice paralysis is likely to occur. If the options are similar with no clear winner, again, it's likely to occur. And finally, if the options are structured in a poor to compare manner, then choice paralysis often happens. So if any of these variables affect your particular category, your business, then be very, very wary of offering too many choices. That will act as a small bit of friction, that will put people off. So what I think is so useful about behavioural science here is it introduces potential tests that you might not think of using. Now, it's very easy as an organisation to argue to have more and more options, more and more different prices, more and more different varieties. What behavioural science is, well, actually, you should test doing the opposite. Because in these particular circumstances, giving people excess choice is likely to be problematic. So that's the first of our slightly counterintuitive ideas. The second counterintuitive idea comes from a psychologist called Ryan Elder at Brigham Young University. And this is a study he ran back in 2012. So he went out and recruited a large group of people, and he showed them a picture of some cake, and then asked them how much they liked it, how much they thought the design of the packaging looked great, whether they were interested in buying it. And after he'd asked them these questions, he then asked them whether they were left or right-handed. Now, the twist in the experiment was that sometimes people saw that picture of the cake with the fork to the left-hand side of the cake, sometimes the fork was on the right. When Elder cut the purchase intent data by whether someone was left or right-handed, he saw a very clear pattern. If the position of the fork matched someone's handedness, there was a 35% increase in likelihood to buy. Now, what I mean by that is I'm right-handed, so if I was eating cake, the natural position I would leave my fork and my spoon was on the right-hand side of the cake. So if I saw a picture like that, that's when my likelihood to purchase would be boosted. Now, at first, when I read about that study, I was a little bit suspicious. It sounded, well, I couldn't really think of a logical, sensible explanation. But what Elder argues is this is an example of a broader idea called perceptual fluency. And it's the argument that if we can imagine doing something, that act becomes more appealing and we're more likely to do it. And the point with the positioning of the fork is that it makes us easier to imagine consuming the cake, and because the cake looks quite appealing, that makes us desire it and want it more. So this is an interesting example, I think, of quite how small and subtle the changes can be to harness this principle and make it easy. You know, even making it easy for someone to imagine consuming your product and purchasing your product can boost appeal. Now, again, most of us probably don't work in the cake business, so you might be thinking, what can you take from this? But again, it's around thinking about these experiments laterally. You know, don't focus on the peripheral detail of the experiment. Think about the core underlying insight. And that core insight, that if you make it easier for people to imagine using a product, they're more likely to do so. You know, that insight can be applied very easily. So, for example, there is a consultant called Michael Agard. And I should stress this isn't a peer-reviewed paper, so take the findings with a little bit of caution. But he took this idea and applied it to sign-ups for brand newsletters. And sometimes, brand trials. Sometimes the website said, start your free trial. Other times it said, start my free trial. Now that is a very small tweak in language. But when you say start my free trial, you're making it a little bit easier for the user to imagine doing so. You're putting things from their perspective. And when he did that, he saw a statistically significant uplift in trial rates. So remember, with all these experiments, don't think because they are run on cakes or pensions, you can't apply them. You know, they are insights into human nature, and those insights can be harnessed in a remarkable range of settings. But moving on from some of the existing academic literature onto why we're all here today. Well, over the last couple of months, YouGov, Vips and myself have been thinking, can some of these principles about making things easier be applied to finances and purchasing? So we ran a very simple study, recruited 809 people, and told them about a potential scenario. So he told them about a new organisation, an umbrella organisation for charities that was linking together the 5 biggest charities in the country and allowing you to donate in one go to those charities, and then that money would be spread equally and it would help reduce their admin costs. Now, people were told a variety of different facts about this potential offering, and then after they'd been told all those facts, they were asked if they wanted to donate. Half of the people were told, do you want to donate by card? Half the people, do you want to donate via VIPs? And amongst the people who were asked to donate via card, 32% of people wanted to do so. Amongst the group in the VIP scenario, that number jumps by 29% to 42%. So just as with all these other scenarios, removing small bits of friction unleashes demand in unexpectedly large ways. Now that's about charities, but the same principle can be applied commercially. So later on in the study, I should say that it wasn't just the interest rate that went up. When people were asked how much they're prepared to donate, you also saw an increase of 6.5%. As I said, though, this doesn't just happen amongst charitable organisations, it also happens amongst commercial ones as well. So again, with a group of 838 people, we went through a very similar approach, but this time telling them about a food delivery service, something like HelloFresh or Gusto. And people were told about this new service that would give them a dinner for about 65 krona per person. They were given lots of information about that service, and then they were asked how likely they would to be sign up. Now again, half the people were told the sign-up mechanic was going to be via card, and that would involve all the normal rigmarole of providing bank ID and such forth. And in that scenario, 40% of people were interested, whereas amongst the second half of people, those who were told the sign-up would be via VIPs, the payment would be via VIPs, sign-up rates went up by 7.5% to 43%. So yes, this idea of removing friction works for charities in the financial space, but it also works commercially. Now, of course, you might think it's all very well and good with this being proven in academic settings, experiments and test and control mechanics which involve people predicting what they would do. But you might be concerned that it doesn't affect people with their real-world cash. But if you're thinking that, you'd be wrong. If anything, we often see larger effects in the real world than in experiments. And that's certainly shown with this difference between VIPs and cards. The removal of those tiny bits of friction has an outsized effect. So this was a real-world experiment run with Aftenposten, looking at the proportion of people who would sign up for a trial subscription. Now, some people were offered that to pay by card, other people via VIPs. And the key finding was that in terms of that sales rate from offer, 0.29% of people signed up when it was via card, 0.31% when it was via VIPs. A 7% increase in sign-up rates based on the removal of tiny transactional blocks. So the key point from today is that we have a fundamental issue as humans. Now, as Daniel Kahneman argues, we think the way to change behaviour is to focus on motivating people to want to change, and we underestimate the importance of friction. Now, the danger is that this doesn't just affect other people, it affects us. So the likelihood is that in your organisation, there might be too much of emphasis on trying to motivate your audience to want to change, too little emphasis on making it as easy as possible to change. So one key thing to remember from today is when you go back to the office, go through that customer journey and identify those tiny, tiny bits of friction that might be putting people off. And if you remove them, they'll tend to have an outsized effect. So that's the core message from today. But before you go, I just want to take you through one final experiment that has a slightly different angle. And everything we've talked about today is about the idea that you want to make it easier for your customer. But there is one slight variant, and that is that your customer doesn't necessarily want to think that it has been easy for you. So for this study, I'm going to turn to the work of an American psychologist called Morales. And she ran a wonderful study a few years ago. She recruited a large group of people who were in market for an apartment. And then she told people, or she gave people a list of 10 apartments that met their requirements. Now, half of the people were told that the estate agent who had generated this list had spent an hour putting the list together, and they had used a computer. So that's what we'd call the low-effort group. Now, in that scenario, when that group were asked to rate the performance of the estate agent out of 100, the average rating was 50 out of 100. The second group of people get exactly the same list of houses, but this time they're told a slightly different story about the estate agent. This time they're told that the estate agent took 9 hours to generate the list of apartments, and they did it manually. Now, in that scenario, there is a 36% improvement in the rating of the estate agent. The average rating is now 68 out of 100. Now, remember, everyone has seen exactly the same list of apartments, but their judgment from the quality of the service varies according to how much effort they think that estate agent put in. Now, Morales says you could argue that this is a logical flaw on people's part. Now, when people are evaluating the quality of a brand, what they should be interested is in the inherent attributes of that brand. That's what matters. But Morales says, as behavioral scientists, we're not interested in what people should do. We're interested in how they actually behave. That's the important thing. And what people actually do is use effort as a proxy for quality. Now, Morales' explanation for this is an interesting one. She argues that when we are faced with complex calculations, we tend to replace them, almost without knowing it, with simpler calculations. She argues that this is a really useful tactic people have for navigating a complex world. So she argues if we're faced with a complex question, we often replace it with a simpler one that gives us an almost as good answer. And actually, evaluating how high quality a product is can be very hard. What's much easier is to grasp how much effort's gone in. So people use that as a substitute question. They judge the quality of a brand from thinking how much effort's gone in. Morales' argument is, now that you know this, you shouldn't make up the effort you've been to as a brand, but you should be more transparent about it. So she argues that brands already go to huge amounts of effort to create a wonderful product. It's just being more transparent about it. That's how you harness this idea. And if you look around, you can often see many brands doing this very well. So Dyson, for example, the bagless vacuum cleaner, the one PR story they continually refer to is the fact they went through 5,000 prototypes to get to the final version. Now, logically, how many prototypes they go through shouldn't really matter. But according to the illusion of effort, this idea from Morales, it will affect people's perception. People will rate the same product, the same vacuum cleaner, as much better, knowing so many prototypes went in. Or Itsu. This is I don't know if fast food chain is here in Norway. It's reasonably big in Britain now. They do a lot of Japanese food. And what they do is emphasize how many hours that their miso master, their soup kind of creator, has put into his trade. So 744,000 hours. You know, that's applying the illusion of effort. So with all discussions of human behavior, there are always nuances. And I think this is one to be aware of when we think about friction. Relentlessly make it easier for your customers to use your products, and you'll have outsized effects. But at the same time, make sure your customers know how much effort you've gone to when creating your product. And if you have those slightly varied approaches to user experience and to messaging, then I think you're harnessing behavioral science to its full power. So I hope that was useful. Behavioral science is a phenomenally varied field. There are literally thousands upon thousands of these biases. I've tried to collect together the ones that I think are most relevant in my book, The Choice Factory. And then in March, there'll be another book coming out called The Illusion of Choice. So I'll discuss principles like Make It Easy and many others in those. So I hope that was useful. But if you have any questions at all, I'd love to take them either now or over coffee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. It's really inspiring to hear all these fantastic cases. There was the sound. Thank you. Anne-Marte will go around with a microphone if someone wants to ask any questions. I have a couple of ones.
Excellent.
Just to turn it around, is there any parts of any organization or any customer journey where it's actually the opposite, where you can add friction and it gets an uplift, or is that impossible?
So that's a good question, and I would say 99% of the time you should be removing friction. But there's a lovely phrase from an Ogilvy creative called Rory Sutherland, where he says, in physics, the opposite of a good idea is a bad idea. In psychology, sometimes the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. And I think we have to recognize that people are not particles, and the context is hugely important. And there can be some rare occasions where you might want to add in friction. So one example might be around an element of choice. So we've talked about excess choice being problematic, but sometimes brands give people just one option, which can be tricky. So there's a lovely set of studies from a Harvard psychologist called Ellen Langer. And back in 1975, she does a classic study. She goes around an office block and she tries to sell people lottery tickets. So every ticket is sold for $1. Now, the twist in the experiment is that sometimes people are given their numbers for the lottery. Other times they get to pick their numbers. Langer then waits a week. She then goes back to the office block and then she tries to buy those tickets back. And she sees a very clear pattern. So people who were given their numbers want about $1.90, $1.95 for their lottery ticket. So they want more. That's an idea called the endowment effect. Once we own something, we want it more. But she wasn't interested in the endowment effect. She was interested in the difference between people who'd been given their numbers and people who'd picked their numbers. And the people who'd picked their numbers wanted more than $8 to sell them back to her. So there was a fourfold variation in valuation of the item, dependent on whether people had an element of choice. Now, Langer's argument is that one of the big drivers of human nature is this desire for control, this desire for what she calls a sense of agency. So she says, even in something that is obviously a commodity, we value it more if we have been involved in picking it. So I do think there is a tiny bit of friction you can often add in around allowing people even a very superfluous level of choice. So, for example, in Britain, there is a huge industry, one of the biggest advertising spenders around people who offer comparisons of insurance. And what most brands do to encourage people to use their comparison service, they'll give you a reward. You compare insurances with compare the market, you get cinema tickets. You compare insurance with money supermarket, you might get £25 to spend at the supermarket. That's giving people no control. What Confused do, who are one of the big brands, is they allow people to pick between 2 or 3 options. So you can have 10 car washes, or you can have a meal box like Gusto, or you can have, I think, let's say, some Netflix account. Now, offering those 3 options is really powerful because let's say everyone went for Netflix as their choice. What most marketers would do, I think, or most businesses would say, okay, well, let's drop the 2 other offerings. No one likes those. Let's just stick with this winner, as it were. But what Langer says is, well, that's a mistake. Part of the appeal of Netflix is the value it brings. But part of the reason people like it so much as an offer is they have had choice. The act of picking it makes it more powerful. So I think in terms of rewards, for example, there could be a tiny bit of friction you want to add in, which is, rather than mandating what people have to have, giving them a choice of A or B. And I think that idea, rewards is an example, but
really interesting.
Could be applied further.
I have one more, if it's time. You started talking about that people's, that in general, that the industry sometimes put more effort into talking about the motivation.
Yeah.
I mean, buy me, I'm better, cheaper, blah, blah, blah,
yeah.
than removing friction. Is that, do you generally see that as a, do many people do more of that? Or is it, or are the UK better at removing friction than we, or what do you think?
I think it's a widespread problem. And I think the problem is because of often how people research. So what most companies do is invest in things like focus groups and direct questioning and surveys. And the problem is that people don't necessarily have full introspective insight into their own motivations. So if you ask someone directly, which of these 2 things would you prefer, people will give you lots of reasons why they pick a lager or why they pick their mobile phone. The problem is most of them will be misleading. There is a wonderful phrase from a psychologist called Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia. He says we are strangers to ourselves. We don't have full introspective insight into our own motivations. So psychologists have this phrase. They say people often in surveys or focus groups try to tell the truth, but because they don't know their own motivations, they end up being misleading. They have this phrase that we confabulate. So I think because we ask people about what would affect their behaviour, we end up reflecting people's claim to be motivated by desire and the quality of the content. People claim that friction wouldn't put them off. Imagine that the Bergman and Rogers study with education. Can you imagine many parents saying, well, I wouldn't be influenced by the content, it's the seconds of effort that would affect me. Parents wouldn't be prepared to admit that. If you ask parents what would affect them, they would say it'd be the caliber of the content. They couldn't possibly, I think, admit either to themselves or to a researcher that they would be influenced by these tiny bits of friction. So, yeah, I think ease is a fundamental problem across multiple countries because research puts too much emphasis on direct questioning and not enough on field experiments, or like we did, these A/B monadic tests.
Just any questions from the audience? Yep.
Michael from Greater Africa. I was a bit shocked about your example about pensions. Why would someone opt out of free money? I think it was about 17%. So obviously some people will actively choose friction and go through a complex form rather than doing absolutely nothing and getting money. So for these type of people, what's the motivation?
Yeah. So, no, that's a fair point, and apologies if I went through that a little quickly. So if you pay money into your pension, you get your tax back in Britain. So if I put in £100 and I'm a basic rate taxpayer, the government make it 120. If I'm a higher rate taxpayer, it could be 145. Also, companies will often, well, now legally have to match what people pay. So you're turning £1 into about £3 by investing in a pension. But for some people, 17%, maybe they don't have that cash. So it's not that that 17% are necessarily behaving completely illogically. If they need to pay their heating or their food bills, they might have to prioritise the present moment. So with all these behavioural science experiments, it's not magic, it's not mind control. People still have free will. So if someone actively doesn't want to be in the pension, they can opt out of it. What's interesting is, though, that there is this remarkably large group who are uncertain, who don't have fixed and definite preferences. And it's those that I think are influenced by the way that choice is displayed. And the key thing there is they're not a inconsequential volume. 22% of people were affected by what's called the choice architecture, how those choices are displayed. So, yes, it can have a very significant effect, but I definitely wouldn't want to give the impression that if you use these biases, everyone will be affected. But we can certainly, I think, either if you're the government, improve the world significantly, or if you're a brand, improve your profitability significantly by applying these ideas. Thank you.
One last question. I have one more. Yesterday evening, I had to fill out this survey, byråprofil, and there was tons of questions. And I must admit, I ended up just pressing the one in the middle while watching a football game.
Yeah.
Because it was so, it was so, I didn't have, it's too much. Because you talked about a lot of these insights is obviously experiments. Do you have any advice on whether to do experiments, observations, or surveys? Where is it good and where is it not so good?
So my preference would be, if possible, to run a natural field experiment. So what you would do there is set up two situations. You would keep in a naturalistic setting, you would keep all the variables the same apart from one, and then any change in the behaviour you would attribute back to that single change variable. So let me give you an example. We're in a hotel at the moment. There's a really famous study from a psychologist called Robert Cialdini. So back in 2008, he tests an idea called social proof. So social proof is the idea that when we make decisions, we are not discrete, atomized individuals, but we often look around to what others are doing. We're deeply influenced by the behavior of others. So in the rooms, half of them he puts up a door hanger saying, please reuse your towel, it's good for the environment. And 35% of people reuse their towel in that scenario. The other half of the rooms get, please reuse your towels. Most guests who've stayed in this room have done so. So he's got rid of any mention of the environment, any logical, rational reason for complying, and instead he just makes it clear what most people do. And in that scenario, you get 49% of people reusing their towels. So you get this 40% improvement on the control. Now that, to me, is the kind of ideal. That's what I would call a field experiment. A completely naturalistic setting. The participants don't even know they're in a study, so they're not going to change their behaviour in any way. They'll behave normally. And then you can attribute any difference to the single change. Not using an environmental message, using a social proof message. And interestingly, when Cialdini reruns that study, but as a survey, and asks people directly, what would influence you? Would it be environment or would it be social proof? Most people claim the environment. So it's a really nice, clear example of claimed data and observed data being very different. But, so in some respects, those type of field experiments can be complicated. But if you think about the Aftenposten, that, and apologies if I'm butchering pronunciations, that would be like a field experiment. Yeah. So if you think of your websites, your e-commerce sites, as basically laboratories and run simple tests and control experiments, you're behaving like a psychologist.
On many websites we see, or e-commerce sites, we see like the title popular.
Popular, yeah.
So that's part of that social proofing.
Yes, right? Although there is a new, I mean, this is the great thing. For every individual experiment, there will be hundreds of satellite experiments. So, yes, popular is powerful, but one of the consistent findings about social proof is we are most influenced by people similar to ourselves. So let's say you're Aftenposten. Rather than saying you're popular amongst Norwegians, if I'm in Oslo, I will be more influenced knowing it's popular amongst people who live in Oslo. I'm a 46-year-old man living in South London. I'll be more influenced by what middle-aged people do, what men do, what Londoners do. So you shouldn't go for the largest possible demonstration of your scale and size. You should tailor it to the audience. And and that's what brands often don't do.
Interesting. And that's also part of your book as well.
One thing I should say, you mentioned about surveys, though. Yeah. Because people might be thinking, well, wait a minute, we ran a survey. And if you notice, if you do want to run a survey, the best thing to do is we essentially follow what's called a monadic split cell approach. You don't ask people directly, which would you prefer to use, VIPs or card? Because everyone will claim it will make no difference. What you do is randomize people into two groups, set up a reasonably realistic scenario, and then ask them, would you buy this via VIPs? Second group, everything's exactly the same. Would you buy this via card? And if you go for that test and control approach, what researchers call monadic split cell approach, it flushes out much more genuine motivations.
Great. Lots of stuff to learn here. Thank you again, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ok, da del 1 over. Men før vi forlater, her så har jeg noen par beskjeder. Vi har jo trukket ut noen vinnere når dere meldte dere på av den boka her. Så en trommevirvel. 5 vinnere. Ida fra Outland, Øyvind fra Profondo, Linda fra Farmasiet, Mario fra Swims og Hanna fra Klassekampen. Gratulerer. Hvis dere her i dag, så har vi bøkene her. Hvis ikke, så får vi tak i dere via vårt andre verktøy. Ok, da det bare for meg å avslutte med litt praktisk info for dere som skal videre på del 2. Som dere ser, så skal vi hjem til oss i VIPS. For dere som ikke har vært der, så det inngangen nå i Dronning Eufemias gate, nummer, jeg tror jeg har det her, 5. Det da, dere kommer til å se dem, det rett etter Deichman. Så vil dere bare gå langs der, så vil dere se masse, vi har rullet ut tepper og ditt og datt, så det åpenbart lett å få med seg. Lunsj starter 11, men registreringen har allerede begynt. Så det bare egentlig bare å tusle bort og bli med allerede nå. Og så det viktig beskjed som jeg har fått viktig å si, at alle som har registrert seg via link på e-post skal ha fått en SMS med denne inngangsbilletten til oss. Og da også der det også en link til programmet. Det skal sies også at programmet står overalt på skjermer og ulike steder, og så det bare å spørre alle oss med sånn VIPS nøkkelring, så skal vi nok hjelpe dere. Har du ikke fått den SMS-en, så må du ta kontakt med min kollega Lene, eller huk tak i en av oss, så skal vi ordne dette her. Ok, det var det. Da ses vi hos oss da. Ha det!